Welcome to Presentation Number 1, Foundations for the IEP. Our objectives in Session Number 1 are to gain an overview of the foundational elements of IEPs and IDEA, to review the evaluation process as it pertains to generating IEPs, and to identify and define key IEP terminology and document sections in order to consider how they fit together. Foundations for the IEP. Each of these terms is significant as we start to explore IEPs. They are part of the puzzle in understanding each of the topics specific to IEPs: due process, communication skills, facilitation skills, IEP meeting essentials, Section 504, IEP manager, special education, and so forth. We will begin to explore those in this session. Of the due process requirements of special education in this presentation, but we will focus on the elements of writing the IEP, the program and the planning part of due process. We will then look at skill development as we get to the final part of this course, where you are going to be creating an agenda and leading an IEP meeting. You need additional skills beyond writing the IEP. You need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to have specific things at a meeting in order for it to run effectively. You need to be able to facilitate. So as that IEP manager, all of these components are important. Finally, you will manage those relationships and meetings well so that you can come up with that final amazing IEP document. Let's think a little bit more about our students who have a disability and bringing it all together. Again, you had a lot of this in your Introduction to Special Education course, but what does it really mean? This person first language, disability not handicap, and all of these items you see in the red bubble. We're talking about due process. So why do we care about due process? It's important that we think about all of the people who fought for the rights of those with disabilities in the history of our country. We have case law, we have legislative history of the civil rights law of our EHA, IDEA, IDEIA. We have 504, which also works with IDIA. We have accountability. We have different resources that we have to think about. This is a big deal when we think about our students and those for whom we are writing IEPs. Part of Section 504 is the part referring to elementary and secondary schools. That's the part we care about. Requires the development of a plan to educate someone who has a disability. The plan is designed to act like a handicap license plate on a car to provide access. It is designed so the student with a disability can gain access to his or her education in the same way a student without a disability can. Because 504 is a civil rights law, failure to provide the accommodations in a 504 plan means the removal of someone's civil rights. This is legally very serious. An IEP is a type of a 504 plan. More about that later. It's putting together a few of the things we've already discussed. A community uses its power and control to elect representatives to a school board to design the education the community wants for students who live there. The school board then passes that power and control on to the administrators, who pass it on to the teachers and committees, etc. in the school. Those individuals design all the things that make a school district a school district. Since education is property, all students in that community have a right to that community-designed education. Educators do not have the right to alter that education without due process. That would be a violation of constitutional rights. IDEA specifies the due process by which we substitute all or part of a given student's education for something specifically designed to meet the needs of that student. 504 does the same. This is why all the minutiae of the special education laws are so important. The other law that specifies due process for removing a student's property or education is the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act, which deals with expulsions. So what is important for us to know? Currently we say IDEA 2004. That is the most recent amendment to the original EHA, which was signed in November of 1975. It was quite a revolutionary law, and although we may think that it was advocacy organizations that brought this law into fruition, it was actually teachers, Federation of Teacher Groups, National Education Association, Council for Exceptional Children, many different groups that were heavily involved because of the case law that was rapidly developing nationwide. So it's hard to have an organized system when there is no system, but an evolving body of law which controls. So they developed a system. So we think about this as the Education of the Handicapped Act, EHA, or the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, but now we know it as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The name was changed in 2004 to Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, but it's usually referred to as IDEA. And just as a fun little historical note, President Ford was flying to China and crossing the international date line at the time this law was signed. Product. It is individualized, it's dynamic and not static. It's team decision making, it's free, appropriate public education, and it's parental involvement. So when we think about that, when we think about an IEP, we often will think about this document of 10 to 15 pages long. But remember, it's a process, and that's why that meeting is so important, because it's during that process where we have the team decision making. And if you recall in Introduction to Special Ed, I harped on this over and over again. You cannot bring a draft written IEP to the meeting because you have basically said there is not a process and it is not about the team making decisions. That in essence, it was you making the decision. So remember that again. Do not bring draft IEPs to the meeting. Rather, bring conversation starters and information about the student and strengths and areas of improvement. And remember, it's dynamic. So when you write this IEP, it doesn't mean that it has to stay the way it is for 12 months. It is static. We look at the student, we look at their progress, we make changes as necessary. So let's think about 504 and IDEA and how it works together. There is a relationship. These relationships also connect to general education. All students who have an IEP also have a 504 plan. Their 504 plan is the IEP. The law specifically states that if the IEP process is done correctly, the district has met its responsibility under 504. Here are some of the similarities and differences between IDEA and 504. There are basically 4 differences. There is no federal or state money for 504. This is why most evaluations for 504 are done under IDEA to first determine eligibility for IDEA. The free standard applies to both and requires districts to pay for 504 evaluations if necessary. The criteria for eligibility is different. Under IDEA, we have specific eligibility criteria which allow us to essentially determine if a given student is disabled enough to use the federal and state money to help educate the student. In 504, the standard is a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. The due process is also different. Depending on which system is your concern, it would be wise to become knowledgeable in that system's due process. Now, for most of you, you will not be dealing with 504s. So this course, your assessment courses, etc., are preparing you to be trained in the areas of IDEA eligibility. The conflict resolution systems are also different. For IDEA, the state or the Minnesota Department of Education has a role in mediations, facilitated IEP meetings, complaints, and hearings. Keep in mind that the state's involvement can change over time. For 504, the system goes from the district directly to a regional federal office, ours is in Chicago, and then to the U.S. Department of Education. Generally speaking, districts prefer to work with the state. The U.S. Department of Education is charged with implementing or executing 504 and IDEA. The USDOE's Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services, OSERS, created both the Office for Civil Rights and the Office of Special Education Programs. From there, the responsibility and authority flows ultimately to the districts. How's that for some new acronyms? There is a Minnesota rule which specifically defines the role of the IEP manager. This law states what an IEP manager must do, meaning what he or she is legally responsible for doing and what he or she may do dependent on district policy. You can reference the parent handout provided in this module and use it as a resource if you wish. Some other resources which may be helpful is knowing who your director of special education is, who your district's monitor and compliance person is through the Minnesota Department of Ed, and simply our Minnesota Department of Ed website. For 504, you would want to know who is your 504 coordinator in your district, and then here is our regional office, which is in Chicago. That was a lot of legal information, but it's important for you to have that foundation before we move into IEP terminology.